Good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Pull the blanket close, breathe in the warmth of the room, and let your thoughts slow. Tonight, we'll travel far back in time to the edge of a new world, when gratitude was not yet a holiday, but a hard-won act of survival. And as you listen, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Share it down in the comments. Our little circle of light spans continents and time zones, joined by the same curiosity that brought people together centuries ago. And of course, if you'd like more journeys into the hidden corners of Lullaby Historian, be sure to subscribe. Each story opens a window into how we came to celebrate and why we remember. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and visualize this.
The Midnight Hearth at Silver Bell Inn. The journey through the White Mountains. The world behind you had begun to fade hours ago. The frantic neon lights of the city, the gray slush of the interstate, and the persistent hum of modern life were now nothing more than a receding memory, tucked away in the rearview mirror. As you crossed the invisible border into the heart of the White Mountains, the landscape underwent a profound transformation. It was as if the earth itself had decided to hold its breath. The sun had already made its slow descent behind the jagged granite peaks of New Hampshire, leaving the sky in a state of perpetual twilight. It wasn't quite night, but the blue had deepened into a rich, velvety indigo that seemed to press down gently on the valley. The air, visible through the windshield as a faint, shimmering haze, was turning bitterly cold, yet inside the car you were cocooned in a bubble of amber warmth. The road, Route 16, winding like a ribbon of black silk through the forest, was flanked by ancient sentinels. Thousands of balsam firs and white pines stood shoulder to shoulder, their branches bowing under the immense weight of a fresh snowfall. This wasn't the thin, watery snow of the lowlands. This was the heavy, crystalline powder of the high country, so white it seemed to glow with its own internal light. Every few miles, a gust of wind would catch the top of a tree, sending a cascade of white dust swirling across the road like the ghosts of 1,000 winter butterflies. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of your tires moving over the packed snow was rhythmic and hypnotic. It was a low-frequency vibration that resonated in your chest, a steady heartbeat for the journey. There was no one else on the road. No headlights flickered in the distance, no taillights offered a guide. You were alone, but oddly, you did not feel lonely. There was a presence in the silence, a feeling that the mountains themselves were watching over your progress, ushering you deeper into their frosted embrace. As the car climbed higher into the notch, the wind began to whistle, a soft, flute-like sound that played against the edges of the window frame. It was a lonely sound, yet deeply comforting, like a lullaby sung by the earth. You reached out to adjust the heater, the dial clicking satisfyingly under your fingers. The scent of the car was familiar, a mix of old leather, the faint metallic tang of the heater, and the lingering aroma of the peppermint tea sitting in your cup holder. The steam from the tea rose in a thin, elegant curl, catching the green glow of the dashboard lights. You glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, of course, piled only with your scarf and a weathered map of the region. And yet, for a fleeting second, you could have sworn you smelled something else, something that didn't belong to you. It was the faint, delicate scent of dried lavender and old paper, the kind of smell you find in a library that hasn't been opened in 100 years. It was gone as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by the crisp, ozonic scent of the winter night seeping through the vents. The road narrowed as you entered a gorge. On either side, the mountain walls rose up like the sides of a great stone cradle. The ice had frozen in mid-drip down the rock faces, forming massive, translucent blue organ pipes that looked as though they might play a frozen chord if the wind hit them just right. Everything was blue and silver.
The moonlight, though partially obscured by the heavy clouds, managed to find cracks in the canopy, casting long skeletal shadows of the maples across the snow. You found yourself slowing down, not because the road was treacherous, but because you didn't want to rush the moment. There is a specific kind of peace that only exists in the mountains during a snowstorm. It is a heavy silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a profound, muffled stillness. The snow acts as a natural acoustic foam, absorbing the noise of the engine and the wind, leaving only the sound of your own breathing. Inhale, exhale. Your breath hitched for a moment as you rounded a sharp bend. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was a stag. He was magnificent, his antlers wide and dusted with white, his eyes two dark orbs reflecting your headlights. He didn't bolt. He simply stood there, a statue of brown fur and muscle, watching as you passed. As your car glided by, you felt a strange sensation, a prickle of electricity at the back of your neck. It felt like a greeting. It felt like being recognized. You realized then that you were no longer just a traveler. You were a guest. The mountains had accepted your presence. The dashboard clock flickered, 11:11 p.m. The numbers glowed a soft neon green. You were close now. The Silver Bell Inn was tucked away in a valley that the locals called the Silent Pocket, a place where the wind supposedly stopped blowing and time moved a little slower. It was said that the inn had been there since the late 1800s, surviving fires, blizzards, and the changing of the centuries, always remaining exactly as it was intended to be, a place for the weary to find rest. A soft hum began to emanate from the car's speakers. You hadn't turned on the radio, and your phone wasn't connected. It was a low melodic vibration, barely audible over the heater. It sounded like a woman humming a Christmas carol, something old, something Victorian, in the bleak midwinter. The melody was fragmented, drifting in and out of the static of the empty airwaves. Instead of reaching to turn it off, you found yourself nodding along. Your eyelids felt heavy, your muscles relaxing into the seat. The tension you had been carrying in your shoulders for months simply dissolved, melting away like a snowflake on a warm palm. The trees began to thin, revealing a wide, flat expanse of white, a frozen lake, perfectly smooth and polished by the wind. On the far side of the lake, a cluster of golden lights appeared. They didn't look like electric lights. They had the soft, flickering quality of candles and oil lamps. They were warm, inviting, and remarkably steady against the vast darkness of the mountain range. This was it, the end of the long climb, the beginning of the quiet. As you turned off the main road and onto the long private driveway of the inn, the tires crunched over a fresh layer of gravel and snow. The driveway was lined with antique wrought iron lampposts, each one capped with a thick hat of snow, casting circles of amber light onto the path. You drove slowly, passing under an archway of intertwined pine branches that smelled so strongly of Christmas it brought a sting of nostalgia to your eyes. You pulled the car to a stop in front of the grand porch of the Silver Bell Inn. The engine gave one final contented purr before you turned the key. Silence rushed in to fill the void, a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. You sat there for a moment, your hands still resting on the steering wheel, looking at the inn. It was a beautiful, sprawling Victorian structure with wraparound porches, turrets, and windows that seemed to glow with a deep inner heat. Smoke curled lazily from 3 different chimneys, rising straight up into the still night air. There were no other cars in the lot, no footprints in the fresh snow on the steps, and yet the front door stood slightly ajar, as if someone had just stepped inside after waiting for you to arrive. The journey through the White Mountains was over. You had reached the sanctuary, and as you prepared to step out into the cold, you felt a phantom touch,
the lightest, most delicate sensation of a hand resting on your shoulder just for a second, offering a silent word of welcome. You were home for the holidays, even if you had never been here before.
The welcome at Silver Bell Inn. The moment you opened the car door, the silence of the White Mountains rushed in to meet you. It wasn't a cold silence, despite the temperature hovering near zero. It was a heavy, expectant stillness. The air was so sharp and clean, it felt like drinking from a glacier spring. Every breath you took felt like it was purifying your lungs, washing away the city grit and the frantic energy of the journey. You stepped out onto the driveway, your boots sinking into several inches of fresh, pristine powder. Crunch, crunch. The sound was loud in the quiet night. You turned back for a moment to look at your car, its headlights still cutting 2 yellow tunnels into the falling snow. When you clicked the fob to lock it, the double beep echoed off the distant rock faces of the notch, a modern sound that felt strangely out of place in this timeless valley. As the lights flickered out, the world plunged into a deep, silvery moonlight. The Silver Bell Inn loomed before you, a grand Victorian lady draped in a shawl of white. Its wraparound porch was wide and deep, supported by thick turned pillars that had been painted a dark forest green. Even in the dark, you could see the meticulous care taken with the building. Hand-carved railings were topped with a frosting of snow, and thick, lush wreaths of real balsam, decorated with oversized pine cones and velvet ribbons the color of dried blood, hung between every window. As you walked toward the steps, the heavy wooden door of the inn didn't just sit there, it seemed to glow from the edges. You climbed the 3 steps, the wood beneath the snow feeling solid and ancient. Before you could even reach for the polished brass handle, a soft click echoed. The door didn't swing wide, but it unlatched just an inch, as if the house itself were drawing in a breath to welcome you. You pushed it open and stepped inside. The transition was physical. It was as if you had stepped through a veil. The biting chill of the New Hampshire night vanished, replaced instantly by a wave of thick, comforting heat that smelled of things long forgotten. It was the scent of a true New England winter, the resinous tang of wood smoke, the sweetness of simmering apple cider with cinnamon sticks, and the clean, waxy smell of beeswax candles. The lobby was a masterpiece of Victorian cozy. The floors were wide plant oak, polished to a dull shine, and covered in thick Persian rugs in shades of indigo and terracotta. To your left, a massive stone fireplace dominated the wall. It was built from river stones, some as large as a man's torso, and inside a fire was roaring. This wasn't a modern gas fireplace with clinical flames. This was a living thing. Great logs of birch and maple hissed and popped, sending tiny showers of orange sparks up the chimney. The light from the hearth cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls, making the dark mahogany paneling look as though it were breathing. "Hello?" you called out softly. Your voice was swallowed by the velvet curtains and the heavy rugs. There was no answer, yet the room didn't feel empty. It felt lived in. It felt watched over. You walked toward the reception desk, a high, curved counter of dark walnut. On top of it sat an antique guest register, its leather binding cracked with age, and a small silver bell, the inn's namesake. The bell was intricately engraved with tiny holly leaves. Next to the bell was a silver tray holding a single, steaming mug of cider and a small plate with 2 ginger cookies, still warm enough that the scent of molasses drifted up to meet you. A small handwritten card sat propped against the mug. The handwriting was exquisite, loopy, elegant, and written in a faded fountain pen ink that looked like it belonged to a different era. For the traveler who has come so far, drink, eat, and let the warmth find your bones. Your key is number 2B at the top of the stairs and to the left. We have been waiting for you. There was no signature. You picked up the mug,
The ceramic was hot against your cold palms, a sensation so grounding it made you sigh. You took a sip. It was perfect, tart, spicy, and hitting your stomach like a liquid hug. As you stood there, leaning against the desk, you heard a sound from the floor above. Thump, thump. It was the soft, rhythmic sound of a rocking chair moving against a wooden floor. Creak, rock, creak, rock. It wasn't a scary sound. It was the sound of a grandmother settling in for the evening. You looked up at the ceiling, where the amber firelight reflected in the polished brass fixtures. "Hello?" you asked again, this time a bit bolder. The rocking stopped. For a heartbeat, the inn held its breath. Then, from the corner of the lobby, near the grandfather clock, you saw a movement, a shadow perhaps, or a trick of the firelight. It looked like the hem of a long gray dress vanishing around the corner toward the kitchen. A faint trail of scent followed it, not the cider or the smoke, but a delicate powdery whiff of lavender and dried roses. You didn't feel afraid. In fact, a profound sense of safety washed over you. It was the feeling you get when you were a child, tucked into bed while the adults sit in the next room, their low voices a protective barrier against the dark. You felt invited. You reached for the key to room 2B. It was a real key, heavy and made of iron, attached to a silk tassel of deep navy blue. As your fingers brushed the wood of the desk, you noticed something you hadn't seen before. In the dust of the mail slots behind the desk, a small silver thimble sat perched on a ledge. It looked as though someone had just put it down a moment ago, perhaps while mending a stray button. Taking your bag, you began the slow climb up the grand staircase. The banister was wide and smooth, the wood cool under your hand. Every few steps, the stairs gave a friendly little groan, acknowledging your weight. The walls of the stairwell were lined with old black and white photographs of the mountains and the inn in the early 1900s. In one photo, dated Christmas 1922, a group of people stood on the front porch. In the center was a young woman with a kind face, wearing a silver shawl and holding a small bell. Her eyes seemed to catch the light of the lobby, even in the photograph. You paused, looking at her. There was a warmth in her expression that felt strangely familiar, as if she was the one who had just left the cider out for you. As you reached the landing, a sudden, gentle draft blew past you. It wasn't the cold draft of a leaky window. It was a warm breeze, like someone had just exhaled a satisfied breath. It carried the faint sound of a melody, just 3 or 4 notes, hummed in a soft alto. All is calm, all is bright. The humming faded as you reached the door to 2B. You stood in the hallway for a moment, the silence of the inn wrapping around you like a heavy quilt. The carpet here was a deep plush burgundy, muffling your footsteps completely. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock downstairs, marking the passage of a time that didn't seem to matter much here. You inserted the heavy iron key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying metallic clack. As the door swung open, you expected to find a dark, cold room. Instead, you gasped softly. A small fire had already been lit in the bedroom's modest fireplace. The embers were glowing red and steady, casting a soft rose-colored light over the room. The bed, which was a massive 4-poster made of dark cherry wood, was already turned down. The white sheets were crisp and smelled of sunshine and line drying, and a hot water bottle, wrapped in a knitted wool cover, lay waiting near the foot of the bed. On the pillow sat a small sprig of fresh evergreen and a tiny silver bell, no larger than a marble. You walked to the window and pulled back the heavy blue velvet curtains. Outside, the snow was falling even harder now, thick flakes dancing in the light of the moon. The world was being buried in white, cutting the inn off from the rest of the mountain, the rest of the state, the rest of the world. You were here. You were safe. And as you sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the warmth of the fire on your face, you heard a soft, muffled sound from the hallway. It was the sound of footsteps, light, rhythmic, and retreating. Step, step, step. then the faint sound of a door closing at the far end of the hall. You realized then that you wouldn't be seeing any other living guests tonight. The Silver Bell Inn had a different way of hosting. You felt a hand, or the ghost of one, brush against your hair, a gesture of pure, maternal kindness. "Thank you," you whispered to the empty room. The fire popped once in response, and the tiny silver bell on your pillow gave a single, microscopic ring, as if stirred by an invisible wind. You weren't just a guest in a hotel. You were a guest in a memory. And as the warmth of the cider finally began to pull your eyelids down, you knew that your sleep tonight would be the deepest, most peaceful rest you had known in years. The room with the blue velvet curtains. The heavy iron key had done its work, and as the door to room 2B clicked shut behind you, the world outside, the snow, the mountains, even the long journey seemed to vanish into a distant dream. The room was not merely a place to sleep. It felt like a curated sanctuary, a pocket of time preserved in amber. The air here was different from the lobby. While the main hall smelled of public hearths and social warmth, this room carried a more intimate, hushed fragrance. It was the scent of sun-warmed wood, pressed linens, and a faint, lingering note of jasmine, sweet, delicate, and strangely out of season for a Vermont December. You stood by the door for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the soft, flickering glow of the hearth. The fireplace was smaller here than the one downstairs, built of smooth, dark river stones that held the heat and radiated it back in steady, pulsing waves. The flames didn't roar, they whispered, licking at the charred oak logs with tongues of blue and violet. On the mantel sat a single, tarnished silver candlestick, though the candle within it was unlit, as if waiting for a hand that no longer carried matches. Your attention was immediately drawn to the curtains. They were the color of the ocean at midnight, a deep, heavy velvet that reached from the high ceiling all the way to the floor. They were so thick that they seemed to absorb any sound from the outside world, creating a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight against your ears. You walked over to them, the plush burgundy carpet swallowing the sound of your boots. When you ran your hand over the fabric, the velvet shifted from navy to a shimmering cobalt, soft as a bird's wing. Behind those curtains lay the winter, but in here there was only the golden dimness. To the right of the window stood a small, round writing desk. It was an elegant piece of furniture with spindly legs and a surface of inlaid bird's-eye maple. On it sat an inkwell made of green glass and a single quill pen. Curiously, there was a sheet of parchment paper laid out, perfectly blank, except for a small indentation at the top, as if someone had started to write and then thought better of it. You sat on the edge of the bed. It was a high four-poster affair, the wood dark as chocolate and carved with intricate vines and small wooden bells. The duvet was a cloud of white down, and as you sank into it, you felt the warmth of the hot water bottle through the layers of wool. It was precisely at the temperature of a living body. As you began to untie your boots, you noticed a small detail that made your heart skip a beat. Near the foot of the bed, on a small wooden bench, your suitcase had been placed. You hadn't brought it up yet. You remembered leaving it in the lobby when you stopped to drink the cider. And yet, there it was, untouched, but moved with impossible silence. "Thank you," you whispered again, your voice barely a breath. The room seemed to respond. A floorboard near the desk gave a gentle creak, and for a split second, you saw a faint distortion in the air, like the shimmer above a hot road in July. It moved from the desk toward the closet, a graceful, sweeping motion that suggested the rustle of a long skirt, though no sound followed. You finished undressing, moving slowly, your body feeling heavier with every passing minute. You slipped into the bed, the cool sheets quickly warming against your skin. The pillows were firm, but gave way perfectly under your head, smelling faintly of the same lavender you had encountered in the hallway. As you lay there, watching the shadows of the fire dance across the blue velvet curtains, the line between waking and sleeping began to blur. The tock-tock of the clock in the hall began to slow down, becoming the steady, rhythmic pulse of the house itself. Then, the dream began, or perhaps it wasn't a dream at all. In the half-light of the dying fire, you saw the door to your room open. It didn't swing wide, it opened just enough for a figure to slip inside. It was the woman in the photograph, the one with the silver shawl. She didn't look like a ghost in the way movies portray them. She wasn't transparent or frightening. She looked like a memory made of soft light. Her hair was tucked up in a neat Edwardian bun, and the silver shawl over her shoulders shimmered as if it were woven from moonlight. She didn't speak. She moved toward the window, her feet making no sound on the rug. With a gesture that was both elegant and practiced, she adjusted the blue velvet curtains, ensuring not a single sliver of the cold night air could penetrate the room. Then she turned toward the bed. You felt a cool floral breeze move across your face as she approached. She leaned over you, her expression one of immense ancient kindness. Her eyes were the color of the evening sky, and in them you saw a reflection of 1,000 Christmases past. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches above your forehead. You felt a sensation of absolute peace. It was as if every worry, every deadline, and every heavy thought you had ever carried was being lifted away by her translucent fingers. You wanted to reach out and touch the fringe of her shawl, but your limbs felt like they were made of warm honey. She leaned down further and whispered. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, a vibration you felt in your soul. Rest now, little bird. The snow is high and the world is far. In this house, time has no sting. You are known and you are welcome. She moved to the hearth and gestured toward the fading embers. With a soft whoosh, the fire didn't grow larger, but it turned a deep, steady crimson, providing a warmth that felt like a physical embrace. Then she picked up the silver bell from your pillow, the one you had noticed earlier, and gave it a tiny, silent ring. The sound resonated inside your head like a crystal bowl being struck. Suddenly, the room transformed. The walls of 2B seemed to dissolve, and for a moment you were standing in the lobby as it was in 1922. The room was filled with laughter, the clinking of punch glasses, and the bright, tinny music of a gramophone playing a festive ragtime. The woman in the silver shawl was there, laughing as she handed a gift to a small child. The air was thick with the smell of roasting goose and oranges. It was a vision of a world where nothing was lost. It was the eternal Christmas of the Silver Bell Inn, a place where every happy moment ever experienced within these walls was stored like a treasure. The vision faded as quickly as it had appeared, pulling you back into the quiet of the blue-curtained room. The woman was standing by the door now, her hand on the knob. She looked back at you one last time, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She raised a finger to her mouth in a shh gesture, and then she was gone. The door didn't click. There was no sound of footsteps. There was only the renewed silence and the steady glow of the hearth. You rolled onto your side, pulling the duvet up to your chin. The heavy velvet curtains rippled slightly, though there was no draft. Outside, a lone owl hooted in the white mountains, a sound that felt miles and centuries away. You felt tucked in, not just by the blankets, but by the very spirit of the place. The midnight hearth had done its work. Your mind, which usually raced with the anxieties of tomorrow, was now a still pool of dark water. As you closed your eyes for the final time that night, the last thing you saw was the reflection of the fire in the glass of the window, looking like a small captive star. You fell into a sleep that was deeper than the snow outside, protected by the blue velvet and the ghost of a woman who had never stopped caring for her guests.
The scent of lavender and old lace. The morning did not arrive with a sudden intrusion of light.
Instead, it filtered into room 2B as a soft, pearlescent haze, struggling to penetrate the heavy defiance of the blue velvet curtains. The world outside was still held in the thrall of the blizzard, and the snow had piled so high against the window pane that the lower glass was completely obscured by a wall of crystalline white. Inside, the fire had settled into a bed of glowing rubies, breathing a dry, rhythmic heat that kept the winter at bay. You awoke not to a sound, but to a sensation, a scent so specific and so out of place that it pulled you from the depths of a dreamless sleep. It was the fragrance of lavender and old lace. It wasn't the sharp, synthetic lavender of a modern air freshener. It was the smell of dried blossoms tucked into a cedar chest, a dusty, herbal sweetness that carried the weight of decades. For a moment, you lay perfectly still, your eyes tracing the patterns of the mahogany canopy above. The air in the room felt thick, almost textured, as if the silence itself had a velvet nap. You turned your head toward the nightstand, expecting to see the empty glass from the night before. Instead, the glass was gone. In its place sat a small lace doily, intricately tatted with patterns of snowflakes, and upon it rested a single dried sprig of lavender tied with a frayed silver ribbon. You sat up, the linen sheets rustling like dry leaves. The room was empty, yet the scent was strongest right there, at the head of the bed, as if someone had been leaning over you, watching you sleep until the very moment your eyes flickered open. The indentation on the pillow beside you was shallow, but unmistakably there, as if a small, weightless head had rested there to share the warmth of the dawn. "Is someone there?" you asked. Your voice was raspy from sleep, sounding small against the vast, muffled quiet of the inn. There was no verbal answer, but as if in response to your question, the silver thimble you had seen downstairs on the mail slot was now sitting prominently on the writing desk across the room. It caught a stray beam of gray morning light, twinkling like a fallen star. You swung your legs out of bed, the floorboards offering their familiar grounding creaks. As you walked toward the window to pull back the curtains, you noticed a trail of something on the burgundy tarpet. It wasn't footprints, but rather a path of disturbed pile, as if a heavy hem of a dress had been dragged slowly across the floor. It led directly from the bed to the large antique wardrobe in the corner. The wardrobe was a towering piece of oak, darkened by age and polished to a mirror shine. Its doors were carved with scenes of harvest and hunt. As you approached it, the scent of lavender intensified, mixing with the sharp medicinal tang of mothballs and the deep earthy smell of old wood. You reached for the handle, a cold iron ring. Just as your fingers brushed the metal, the wardrobe door swung open on its own, not with a jump, but with a slow, deliberate grace. Inside, the wardrobe was mostly empty, save for a single garment hanging on a wooden peg. It was a silver shawl, the same one from the photograph, the same one from your dream the night before. Up close, it was a marvel of craftsmanship. The lace was so fine it looked like spider webs frozen in ice, shimmering with a dull metallic luster. You reached out and touched the fabric. It was icy cold, yet it sent a jolt of warmth up your arm, a paradoxical sensation that made your breath hitch. As you pulled your hand back, a small piece of paper fluttered from the folds of the shawl and landed at your feet. It was a scrap of a letter, the edges yellowed and brittle. The handwriting matched the note from the lobby desk. "The lace must be finished by Christmas Eve. Clara says the guests expect the finest, and we shall not disappoint them. Even if the snow closes the mountain, the heart of the silver bell must remain warm. I can smell the lavender drying in the attic even now. The date at the top was December 20th, 1921. A sudden sharp tink echoed through the room. You spun around. The silver bell on the nightstand had moved. It was no longer sitting on the sprig of evergreen. It had been placed perfectly in the center of the lace doily. You realized then that this was not a haunting of fear, but a haunting of maintenance. The presence in the room, this Clara mentioned in the letter, was busy. She was preparing. She was tidying. She was ensuring that even a century later, her guest felt the meticulous care of a Victorian hostess. You walked over to the wash basin in the corner. A pitcher of water sat there, and to your amazement, steam was still rising from it. You dipped your fingers in. It was scaldingly hot. Beside the basin lay a fresh towel draped over a wooden rack. It was stiff with starch and smelled of lye and fresh air. As you splashed the warm water onto your face, you felt a strange, playful pressure on your shoulder, a quick, light tap, like someone trying to get your attention. You looked into the silver-backed mirror above the wash basin. For a heartbeat, you didn't see your own reflection. You saw the blurred image of a woman standing behind you. She was adjusting a lace collar at her throat, her face pale and beautiful, her eyes fixed on yours with a quiet satisfaction. She held a needle and thread in one hand and a sprig of lavender in the other. You blinked, and the image vanished. Only your own sleep-muddled face stared back, eyes wide open with wonder. The scent of lavender began to fade then, retreating toward the door, followed by the faint rhythmic snip, snip, snip of invisible shears. It seemed the morning chores were moving to the hallway. You sat back down on the bed, holding the small sprig of lavender in your hand. The white mountains were silent outside, buried under a sea of white, but inside the Silver Bell Inn, the past was vibrantly, gently alive. You weren't alone in room 2B. You were being looked after by a ghost who still believed that a guest deserved the finest lace and the sweetest scents. The fear you might have expected to feel was entirely absent. In its place was a profound sense of being cherished. You leaned back against the headboard, closing your eyes, and for a moment you could hear the distant, muffled sound of a sewing machine whirring somewhere in the walls, the heartbeat of a house that refused to let the beauty of 1921 fade away.
Tea for one, or perhaps for two. The hunger that woke you was not a sharp, demanding pang, but a slow, hollow realization that the warmth of the cider from the night before had finally dissipated. The room was still hushed, the blue velvet curtains standing like silent sentinels against the mountain chill. As you dressed, pulling on a heavy wool sweater that felt coarse but comforting against your skin, you noticed the scent of lavender had shifted. It was no longer the dominant note in the air. Instead, a new aroma was rising through the floorboards, the buttery, toasted scent of baking flour and the sharp, tannic ghost of steeping tea. You stepped out into the hallway. The inn seemed even more cavernous in the daylight. The long corridor with its high ceilings and narrow runners of burgundy carpet felt like a tunnel through time. As you descended the grand staircase, the wood groaned under your feet, a familiar greeting that seemed to announce your arrival to the house. The lobby was empty of people, but the fire in the great stone hearth had been rebuilt. New logs of silver birch sat atop the white ash, their bark curling and blackening as the heat took hold. You followed the scent of the tea toward the back of the inn, where a set of double swinging doors, heavy oak with small porthole windows, led into the dining room. The dining room was a solarium of sorts, with 3 walls made almost entirely of glass, though today they offered only a view of the swirling white void. The blizzard had not relented. It had only become more intimate, pressing its snowy face against the panes.
In the center of the room, a single table had been set. It was a small, round table draped in a white linen cloth, so stiff with starch it looked like carved marble. On it sat a breakfast service for two. There were two delicate porcelain cups, thin enough to be translucent, decorated with hand-painted cornflowers. There was a silver tea strainer, a bowl of rough-cut sugar cubes, and a small crystal pitcher of cream. In the center of the table stood a heavy, soot-stained iron teapot. Steam rose from its spout in a steady silver plume. You hesitated. "Hello? Is there someone else staying here?" The only sound was the wind rattling a loose pane of glass and the distant rhythmic thump of snow falling from the roof. You approached the table. The chair facing the window was pulled out, as if waiting for you. The chair opposite it was also pulled out, just an inch, angled toward the table at a conversational degree. You sat down. The tea was already poured into the cup nearest you. It was dark amber red and smelled of bergamot and wood smoke, a classic Earl Grey. You reached for the sugar, but before your fingers could touch the tongs, the sugar bowl slid an inch toward you. It wasn't a sudden jarring movement. It was smooth, as if the table had tilted slightly, though you knew it remained perfectly level. "Thank you, Clara," you said softly, testing the name you had seen on the scrap of paper. A sudden warmth bloomed in the air directly across from you. It wasn't the heat of the radiators, it was the specific warmth of a person sitting nearby. You looked at the empty chair. The velvet cushion was slightly depressed, as if a small, light figure had taken a seat. You picked up your cup. Your hands were still a bit shaky from the cold, but the tea was exactly the right temperature. As you took a sip, you noticed a small plate of scones had appeared on the table. You were certain they hadn't been there a second ago. They were small, golden brown, and studded with dried currants. Next to them was a tiny dish of clotted cream and a jar of damson plum jam. As you ate, the atmosphere in the room changed. The silence became less empty and more filled. You felt as though you were in the middle of a very quiet conversation, one that didn't require words. You found yourself talking anyway, your voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the storm. "It's beautiful here," you said to the empty chair. "I've never seen snow like this. It feels like the rest of the world has just stopped existing." The steam from the teapot suddenly swirled, forming a brief, delicate spiral in the air before vanishing. Across from you, a spoon lifted from the saucer. It moved through the air with a steady hand, dipped into the sugar bowl, and then hovered over the second, empty cup. 2 cubes were dropped in, plink, plink, followed by a splash of cream that seemed to pour itself from the pitcher. The spoon stirred the tea in the empty cup. You watched, mesmerized, as the silver utensil moved in a perfect circle, the clinking of metal against porcelain sounding like a tiny melodic bell. When it finished, the spoon was laid back down on the saucer with a gentle, final clack. You felt a wave of profound melancholy wash over you, followed immediately by a sense of deep contentment. It was a strange duality, the sadness of a life past mixed with the joy of a hospitality that refused to end. "How long have you been here?" you asked. This time the answer came not in a sound, but in a vision. As you looked through the steam of your own tea, the dining room seemed to flicker. For a fleeting second, the snowy white windows were gone. In their place, you saw a vibrant spring morning. The apple trees outside were in full bloom, their pink blossoms drifting like a different kind of snow. The room was full of guests, men in high collars and women in summer dresses, their voices a bright tapestry of gossip and laughter. And there, at this very table, sat a younger version of the woman in the silver shawl. She was laughing, her hand resting on the arm of a man who was pouring her a cup of tea. She looked vibrant, alive, and fiercely happy. The image snapped back to the present. The apple trees were once again buried in white. The guests were gone. The room was silent. But the second cup of tea was now half empty. you realized that for the ghosts of the Silver Bell, time wasn't a straight line. It was a collection of moments that they could revisit, and by staying here, you were being invited to share in those moments. You weren't just eating breakfast, you were participating in a ritual that had been performed thousands of times. You finished your scone and leaned back. The warmth from the presence across the table began to fade, moving toward the kitchen doors. "Wait," you called out. The swinging doors moved slightly, as if caught in a draft. On the white linen tablecloth, near the empty teacup, a single word had been traced in the spilled sugar. It was written in the same elegant, loopy script: "Stay." You looked out at the blizzard. There was no way to leave, even if you wanted to. The roads would be impassable for days. But as you looked at the empty chair and the fading steam of the teapot, you realized you had no desire to go. The world outside was loud, fast, and cold. Inside the Silver Bell, with Clara and her lavender-scented memories, everything was quiet, slow, and warm. You reached out and touched the second cup of tea. It was still warm to the touch. "I'll stay," you whispered. A soft, muffled chime rang out from the lobby, the grandfather clock striking the hour. It sounded less like a clock and more like a heartbeat. You picked up the iron teapot and poured yourself a second cup, settling in for a long, slow morning in the company of a ghost who knew exactly how much sugar you took in your tea.
The library's hidden alcove. The breakfast in the dining room had left you in a state of tranquil suspension. As you stepped back into the lobby, the grandfather clock gave a low, resonant hum, as if vibrating with the secret you now shared with the house. The storm outside continued its relentless white vigil, but the interior of the Silver Bell Inn felt increasingly like a world complete unto itself. Following a narrow hallway lined with framed botanical sketches, you found yourself standing before a pair of tall pocket doors made of dark mahogany. They were slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. This was the library, a room that felt like the very brain of the inn, where the memories of a century were filed away in leather-bound volumes. The air here was cooler, smelling of old paper, binding glue, and the faint, sharp tang of floor wax. It was a dry, scholarly scent that invited whispers. Dust motes danced in the thin gray light filtering through a high clerestory window. The room was shaped like an octagon, with a rolling ladder attached to a brass rail that disappeared into the shadows near the ceiling. You walked slowly along the perimeter, your fingers trailing over the spines of the books. There were Victorian novels, thick medical encyclopedias, and travelogues of the Orient. As you reached the far corner, tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain that matched the ones in your room, you discovered a hidden alcove. In this small nook sat a high-backed wing chair upholstered in faded green brocade. Beside it was a small mahogany pedestal table holding a heavy brass reading lamp with a green glass shade, a banker's lamp that looked as though it had been polished that very morning. As you sat in the chair, the springs gave a familiar, welcoming groan. On the table lay a book that was clearly left for you. It was a simple cloth-bound journal with a spine that had been reinforced with black tape. You picked it up. The cover was blank, but when you opened the first page, the same elegant, loopy handwriting you had seen before leaped out at you. December 21, 1924. The snow has reached the second-story windows. We're marooned, but the guests are in high spirits. Thomas played the piano until midnight. I fear the lavender is running low, but the lace for the new curtains is nearly finished. Sometimes, when the wind howls in the chimney, I feel the house itself listening to us. You turned the pages, your heart beating a little faster. The journal was a chronicle of life at the Silver Bell Inn
through the eyes of Clara. She wasn't just a hostess, she was the guardian of the house's soul. She wrote about the guests, the young couples on their honeymoons, the grieving widows seeking solace in the mountain air, and the children who believed the silver bells on the Christmas tree were magical. As you read, the light in the alcove seemed to dim, focusing intensely on the pages of the journal. You reached for the switch on the brass lamp, but before you could touch it, the green glass shade flickered and the lamp hummed to life on its own. The light it cast was not the harsh white of a modern bulb, but a warm, flickering yellow that mimicked a candle's flame. A soft, rhythmic sound caught your ear. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It sounded like a pen moving across paper. You looked down at the journal in your lap. A new line of ink was appearing on the blank page opposite the entry from 1924. It was as if an invisible hand were writing in real time, the ink appearing out of thin air, wet and glistening. The library is a place for secrets. Look behind the poet. You stood up, the journal still in your hands. Behind the poet? You whispered. You scanned the shelves near the alcove. Your eyes landed on a bust of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, carved from white marble and yellowed by years of pipe smoke. It sat on a shelf between volumes of Milton and Dante. You reached behind the cold stone head of the poet. Your fingers brushed against a small, hidden latch. With a faint click, a section of the bookshelf swung inward by a few inches. It wasn't a secret room, but a shallow compartment, a hitting hole used for valuables. Inside lay a small wooden music box. It was made of bird's eye maple, the same wood as the writing desk in your room. On the lid was an inlay of a silver bell. As you took the music box out, the scent of lavender and old lace returned, so strong it felt like a physical presence standing right behind your shoulder. You felt a faint, cool pressure on your elbow, as if someone were guiding your hand. You wound the key on the bottom of the box. The mechanism was stiff at first, but then it began to turn. The melody that emerged was the one you had heard hummed in the hallway, in the bleak midwinter. The notes were clear and crystalline, ringing out in the silent library like falling ice. As the music played, the shadows in the room began to shift. You saw reflected in the glass of the bookshelves the image of a woman standing in the alcove. She was wearing the silver shawl, her hands folded primly in front of her. She wasn't looking at you, but at the music box, her expression one of deep, wistful longing. "Is this yours?" you asked softly. The reflection nodded, a tiny, graceful movement. She raised her hand and pointed towards the ceiling, towards your room. Then the music box reached the end of its song. The last note lingered in the air, vibrating against the glass. As the sound finally died away, the reflection in the bookshelf was gone, and the green lamp flickered once and went dark. You were left in the gray twilight of the library, holding the music box. The journal in your other hand felt heavier than before. You realized that Clara wasn't just showing you her home, she was giving you a task. The music box needed to be returned to its proper place, perhaps to break a silence that had lasted far too long. You tucked the music box under your arm and picked up the journal. The library felt different now, no longer a room of dusty books, but a living archive of a woman's love for her guests and her home. As you walked back towards the lobby, you passed the grandfather clock. It struck the half hour with a sound that seemed to say, "Thank you." You realized that the Silver Bell Inn wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a place to remember things the world had forgotten. And Clara, the lady in the silver shawl, was ensuring that you were the one to remember them.
The gentle hum of a Christmas carol.
The music box felt heavy in your hands, its polished wood smooth and unnervingly warm, as if it had been sitting in the sun rather than hidden behind a cold marble bust. As you left the library, the melody of In the Bleak Midwinter seemed to linger in the very marrow of your bones, a ghostly resonance that hummed even after the gears had stopped turning. The inn was growing darker. Outside, the blizzard had reached a fever pitch, the wind wailing against the eaves like a lost soul. But inside, the air was becoming increasingly rhythmic. As you moved through the lobby, you heard it, a low, melodic vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was the gentle hum, a soft alto voice singing without words, weaving through the cracks of the floorboards and the folds of the heavy drapery. It was the voice of the woman in the silver shawl, and it was leading you. You didn't go back to your room. Instead, the hum pulled you toward the rear of the inn, past the kitchen, and toward a narrow, forgotten hallway that smelled of cedar and cold stone. The wallpaper here was different, faded Victorian stripes of gold and sage, peeling slightly at the corners to reveal the rough-hewn timber of the original 19th century structure. As you walked, the music box in your hand began to vibrate. It didn't make a sound, but you could feel the internal brass drum spinning, desperate to release its song. You stopped in front of a small, inconspicuous door under the service staircase. It had no handle, only a small keyhole rimmed in tarnished silver. You remembered the tiny silver bell on your pillow from the night before, the one no larger than a marble. You reached into your pocket, and your fingers closed around it. To your surprise, the bell wasn't just a trinket. It had a small, thin protrusion at its base, shaped exactly like the bit of a skeleton key. You inserted the bell into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. With a soft chim click, the door swung inward. Beyond the door lay a small circular room, a meditation cabinet or a sewing nook, perhaps. It was located at the very base of one of the inn's turrets. The walls were lined with windows, but they were so frosted over with ice that they looked like panels of stained glass. In the center of the room sat a solitary rocking chair, and next to it, a tall, narrow stand holding a heavy leather-bound scrapbook. The hum was louder here. It was no longer a distant melody, it was right beside you, a warm breath against your ear. Snow had fallen, snow on snow. You placed the music box on the stand and opened the scrapbook. The pages were filled with pressed flowers, lockets of hair tied with silk ribbons, and hundreds of tiny hand-drawn sketches of guests. But it was the last page that caught your breath. Taped to the paper was a photograph of a man in a soldier's uniform, dated 1918. His eyes were kind, bearing a striking resemblance to the man you had seen in the T-Vision earlier. Tucked behind the photo was a telegram, its yellowed paper brittle to the touch. It read, "Regret to inform, missing in action, Northern Front." Beside the telegram, in Clara's unmistakable hand, was a final entry. "The world has grown silent. Thomas will not be home for the hearth this year. But I shall keep the silver bells ringing. I shall keep the tea warm. For as long as this house stands, no one who enters shall ever truly be alone in the cold." The discovery hit you with a profound empathy. Clara wasn't just a ghost trapped by tragedy. She was a ghost who had transformed her grief into an eternal act of service. She had turned the Silver Bell Inn into a fortress of warmth because she knew exactly what it felt like to be left out in the cold. Suddenly, the music box on the stand began to play on its own. It didn't play In the Bleak Midwinter this time. Instead, it played a bright, upbeat version of Deck the Halls. As the music filled the small turret room, the ice on the windows began to melt, not from heat, but from a sudden blinding light. You looked out through the glass and saw for a fleeting second the image of a man walking toward the inn through the snow. He was wearing a heavy military coat, and he was waving. On the porch, the woman in the silver shawl stood waiting, her arms open, her face radiant with a joy that transcended death. It was a hidden discovery of a different kind, not a secret of the house, but a secret of the heart. You were witnessing the moment Clara's vigil had finally been rewarded, a memory so powerful it had imprinted itself onto the very fabric of the room. The vision faded, and the room returned to its quiet, wintry state. The music box slowed, the last note a long, resonant chime that echoed the silver bell in your hand. You felt a hand rest on yours, a firm, warm, and decidedly real sensation. You looked down, and for a second, you saw the silver lace of a sleeve resting against your sweater. "He came home," you whispered. The hum shifted into a soft, contented sigh. The air in the room grew lighter, the scent of lavender replaced by the smell of fresh pine and celebration. You realized that by finding this room and acknowledging her story, you had participated in the completion of her journey. You closed the scrapbook and picked up the music box. As you stepped back into the hallway and locked the small door with the silver bell, you felt a change in the house. The gentle hum was no longer a lonely sound, it was a harmony. The Silver Bell Inn was no longer just a place where you were staying, it was a place where you were a witness to a love that the mountains could not bury. And as you walked back toward the lobby, you found yourself humming along with the walls, your own voice joining the ancient, beautiful melody of the house.
The lady in the silver shawl. The house was breathing. As the clock in the lobby struck midnight, the sound didn't chime so much as it rippled through the air, vibrating the floorboards beneath your feet. The blizzard outside had reached a rhythmic peak. The wind no longer shrieked, but instead performed a deep, low-frequency thrum against the stone foundations of the Silver Bell Inn. You found yourself drawn toward the grand parlor, a room you had only glimpsed in passing. The double pocket doors were already wide open, as if the room had been exhaling. The parlor was the most formal space in the inn, filled with velvet settees, mahogany tea tables, and a massive grand piano that sat in the curve of the bay window like a sleeping beast. Moonlight, sharpened by the reflective power of the deep snow, cut through the windows in long silver lances. It illuminated the dust motes that hung suspended in the air, making them look like a galaxy of tiny, frozen stars. And there, standing by the piano, was the woman. For the first time, she was not a reflection, a shadow, or a flicker in the corner of your eye. She was standing in the full, cold light of the moon. She was petite, her posture as straight as a winter pine, wearing a high-collared dress of charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the shadows. But it was the silver shawl that captured your gaze. It was draped over her shoulders like a web of liquid moonlight, its intricate lace patterns shimmering with every slight movement of her breath. She was beautiful in a way that felt distant and untouchable, like a portrait painted in frost. Her face was pale, her features delicate, and her eyes, a deep, intelligent blue, were fixed on the keyboard of the piano. You stayed perfectly still, afraid that even a sharp intake of breath would shatter the moment. The scent of lavender and old lace was so thick it felt as though you were standing in a drying room. "Clara?" you whispered. She didn't startle. She slowly turned her head toward you. A small, sad smile touched her lips, a smile that held the weight of a century's worth of Christmases. She didn't speak with her voice, but you felt her thoughts move through the air like a warm draft.
The music is still here, the thought echoed in your mind. It never really leaves the wood. It just waits for someone to listen. She turned back to the piano and raised her hands. Her fingers were long and translucent, the moon shining right through the delicate bones of her wrists. When she pressed the keys, the sound was not the bright, percussive strike of a modern piano. It was muted, soft, and slightly out of tune, as if the notes were being played through a layer of heavy velvet. She began to play a melody you didn't recognize, something slow, haunting, and deeply American, reminiscent of an old Appalachian folk song. As she played, the parlor began to change. The shadows on the walls started to move, independent of the firelight. You saw the silhouettes of people appearing on the wallpaper, couples dancing, children running, an old man raising a glass in a silent toast. The lady in the silver shawl was not just playing a song, she was reweaving the history of the room. You walked closer, drawn by the magnetism of the music. As you reached the edge of the piano, the air around her grew colder, but not uncomfortably so. It was the dry cold of a cellar where fine wine is kept. You looked down at the music rack. There was no sheet music there, only a single dried rose and a small silver bell. She stopped playing abruptly, though the final chord continued to hum inside the piano for a long, impossible time. She looked up at you, and for a moment, the distance between the living and the dead vanished. You saw the fine lines around her eyes, the texture of the silver lace, and the slight tremble in her hands. "Why do you stay?" Your voice trembling. She reached out. For a second, her translucent hand hovered over your own. You didn't feel skin or bone. You felt a tingling sensation, like static electricity, or the prickle of a limb falling asleep. It was the feeling of 1,000 memories trying to pass through a single point of contact. Because a house needs a heartbeat, the thought came, clearer this time. The mountains are vast and hungry. They swallow the lonely. I stay so that the light in the window is never a lie. I stay to keep the hearth for those who are still on their way home. She stood up, her shawl rippling like water. She walked toward the bay window and placed a hand against the frosted glass. Where her fingers touched the pane, the ice instantly melted into the shape of a small, perfect bell. She looked out at the white void of the storm. In the distance, through the swirling snow, you saw a faint, flickering light, the headlights of a car, or perhaps a lantern. It was miles away, struggling against the notch. Clara turned to you and took the silver bell from the piano. She pressed it into your palm. This time, the contact felt solid. The metal was ice cold, but as it touched your skin, it began to glow with a soft, pulsing amber light. "Ring it," she commanded. You raised the bell and shook it. The sound it made was unlike any bell you had ever heard. It wasn't a metallic clang. It was a pure, crystalline note that seemed to cut right through the roar of the blizzard outside. It was a sound of absolute clarity, a signal fire made of audio. Outside, the distant light in the storm seemed to steady itself. It stopped flickering and began to move forward with renewed purpose. The lady in the silver shawl nodded. Her form began to soften, the sharp edges of her silhouette blurring into the moonlight. She was retreating back into the atmosphere of the inn, back into the scent of the lavender and the grain of the wood. "Will you see me again?" you asked, reaching out toward the silver lace that was now becoming mist. "I am in the tea," her voice whispered in your mind, fading like an echo. "I am in the fire. I am in the click of the lock and the warmth of the quilt. I am the silver bell. As long as you are here, you are never alone." With a final shimmering flash, she was gone. The parlor was once again empty, save for the moon and the shadows. You stood by the piano, the silver bell still warm in your hand. The scent of lavender lingered for a moment longer, then settled into the background, becoming just another part of the house. You looked out the window. The blizzard was still there, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like a curtain drawn around a very private, very sacred stage. You turned and walked back toward the lobby, the bell tucked safely in your pocket. You felt a strange, light-headed joy, the kind of feeling you get after a long, honest conversation with an old friend. The lady in the silver shawl was the guardian of the hearth, and tonight she had shared the flame with you.
Whispers in the hearth. The encounter with Clara in the parlor had left your senses heightened, as if a layer of frost had been scraped away from your perception. You returned to the main lobby, drawn by a heat that felt more magnetic than thermal. The great stone fireplace, the literal and figurative heart of the Silverbell Inn, was pulsing. You sat in the deep, wing-back leather chair positioned just a few feet from the hearth. The fire had transformed. The bright, snapping orange flames of the early evening had matured into a deep, concentrated crimson. The logs, thick rounds of hickory and sugar maple, were now glowing skeletons of charcoal, their surfaces mapping out intricate, shifting grids of white ash and orange light. As you leaned your head back, the silence of the inn began to fray at the edges. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the creaking of the old timber. It was a sound coming from inside the fire. Hiss, pop, murmur. At first, it sounded like the natural release of gases from the wood, but as you focused, the sounds began to take on the cadence of human speech. It was a chorus of voices layered over one another like a soft vocal tapestry. These were the whispers in the hearth, the collected echoes of 1,000 conversations held in front of this very fire over the last century. You closed your eyes, and the heat against your face became a canvas. "She's going to say yes, I just know it," a young man's voice whispered, vibrant with the nervous energy of 1945. You could almost hear the clink of a small velvet box being opened. "Look at the way the light hits the ring. It looks like a piece of the star." The fire popped sharply, and the voice shifted. "I'm tired, Martha. The city is too loud. Let's stay another week. Just another week of this quiet." This voice was older, gravelly, and laden with the weariness of the Great Depression. The mountains don't ask anything of you. They just let you be. The whispers weren't just words, they were emotional imprints. You felt the surge of a secret shared between sisters in the 1920s, the hushed planning of a business deal in the 50s, and the soft lullabies hummed by mothers to colicky infants while the rest of the inn slept. The fireplace was a repository, a stone and iron ear that had listened to the heart of humanity for decades, and now, in the deep of a snowbound night, it was playing them back for you. You opened your eyes and looked into the embers. The glowing coals seemed to shift, forming shapes that mirrored the voices. For a moment, you saw the flickering silhouette of a woman in a cloche hat leaning toward a man in a waistcoat. Then the shape collapsed into a shower of sparks, reforming into a child sitting cross-legged on the rug, staring up at the mantel. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the murmurs, a distinct metallic clink. You looked up at the mantel. Amidst the dried evergreen boughs and the pewter candlesticks, a small object was vibrating. It was an old iron skeleton key, tied with a bit of frayed red twine. As you watched, the key slid slowly across the stone, moving toward the edge of the mantel as if pulled by an invisible magnet. You reached up and caught it just before it fell. The iron was searingly hot, yet it didn't burn your skin. Instead, the heat seemed to flow into your palm, carrying with it a sudden vivid image of a door you hadn't seen yet, a door tucked behind the heavy tapestry in the library. The stories aren't just in the air,
a voice whispered from the very center of the fire, a voice that sounded remarkably like the lady in the silver shawl. They are in the iron, they are in the stone, they are the weight that holds the house down when the wind tries to take it. You looked back at the fire. A log shifted, collapsing into a bed of brilliant white ash. As it did, a puff of smoke rose up, momentarily taking the shape of a hand. It gestured toward the key in your palm and then pointed toward the stairs. The whispers began to fade into a collective rhythmic hum, the sound of 100 good nights spoken across the decades. The fire was settling for the night, its stories told, its heat now a gentle, drowsy blanket. You felt a profound sense of responsibility. You were now the keeper of these whispers. You were the one who had listened when the house decided to speak. The key in your hand felt like a promise that there was more to discover, more memories to unlock, and more warmth to be found in the frozen heart of the White Mountains. As you stood up to head to your room, the last ember in the hearth gave one final bright flash. "Sleep well, keeper," the fire seemed to sigh. You walked toward the stairs, the iron key clutched tightly. The whispers in the hearth followed you in your mind, a gentle, ghostly lullaby that made the long, dark hallway feel like the safest place in the world. The Silver Bell Inn was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a conversation you were finally learning how to join. The snowbound silence. By the time you reached the landing of the second floor, the world beyond the walls of the Silver Bell Inn had ceased to exist. In the earlier hours of the evening, you could still hear the occasional groan of a distant tree branch or the sharp whistle of the wind as it sliced through the mountain notch. But now, a new stage of the storm had arrived, the snowbound silence. This was not merely an absence of noise, it was a physical presence. The snow had piled so high against the ground floor windows that the light from the street lamps, if they were even still lit, could no longer reach the inn. The building was encased in a thick, insulating shroud of white. It felt as though the inn had been lifted off the map of New Hampshire and placed into a quiet, starlit pocket of the universe where time had no dominion. You stood by the tall window at the end of the hallway, pulling back the heavy drapes. You didn't see the road, the trees, or the neighboring peaks. You saw only a soft, glowing wall of white, illuminated from within by the moon's hidden light. The silence was so absolute that you could hear the soft, rhythmic thrum-thrum of your own heart and the infinitesimal sound of a single snowflake sliding down the glass. In this moment, the anxieties that had followed you into the mountains, the deadlines, the digital tethers, the weight of the real world simply evaporated. They didn't just feel distant, they felt impossible. How could a world of hurry exist when the very air was this still? You walked back toward room 2B, but your feet felt light, as if you were walking on the clouds themselves. The iron key you had retrieved from the hearth was tucked in your pocket, radiating a steady, gentle warmth against your hip. Inside your room, the fire had settled into a low, violet-red glow. The scent of lavender and old lace had merged with the smell of cold, fresh snow, creating a fragrance that was incredibly crisp and clean. You didn't turn on the lamps. You didn't need to. The room was bathed in a luminous dark, a silver-gray light that made every object seem more defined, more intentional. You sat in the velvet armchair by the window and let the silence wash over you. It felt like being submerged in cool, clear water. This is the peace they all came for, a thought drifted into your mind, sounding less like a ghost and more like your own soul finally speaking up. As you sat there, the wall opposite the bed began to shimmer. In the snowbound silence, the barriers between then and now were at their thinnest. You watched as the wallpaper seemed to dissolve, replaced by a window into another Christmas many decades ago. You saw the room as it looked in the winter of 1930. The furniture was rearranged. A small wooden rocking horse sat in the corner, and a sprig of real mistletoe hung from the chandelier. On the bed sat a young woman, her face glowing with a quiet, meditative joy. She was knitting a scarf of deep emerald green, her needles clicking in a soft, rhythmic meter that perfectly matched the ticking of the clock. She looked up and seemed to see you. She didn't look surprised. She simply smiled, a slow, peaceful expression that said, "I am glad you finally found the quiet." She went back to her knitting, and the vision slowly faded, leaving only the silver moonlight and the scent of pine. The experience didn't feel supernatural in the frightening sense. It felt natural, as if the Silver Bell Inn were a giant record player, and the snowbound silence was the needle that allowed the music of the past to play. You realized that thousands of people had sat in this very spot, watching the snow bury the world, and had felt exactly what you were feeling, the profound relief of being unreachable. You felt a sudden deep drowsiness. It wasn't the heavy, drugged sleep of exhaustion, but a timeless sleep. You moved to the bed, the sheets feeling like cool silk against your skin. As you pulled the duvet up to your chin, you felt the phantom touch again, the light maternal pressure of a hand tucking the blanket around your shoulders. "Good night, Clara," you whispered into the stillness. A tiny crystalline sound echoed through the room, a single delicate ring of a silver bell, so soft you might have imagined it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding inch after inch to the silent wall. Inside, the fire gave a last contented pop. You closed your eyes, and for the first time in years, your mind was completely blank. No thoughts of tomorrow, no regrets of yesterday, only the deep white silence, only the warmth of the hearth, only the perfect, timeless peace of the Silver Bell Inn. You drifted off into a dream that wasn't a dream at all, but a continuation of the quiet. You were no longer a traveler in the storm. You were a part of the mountain's sleep.
Midnight cocoa in the kitchen. The deep, heavy sleep of the snowbound silence had lasted for hours, but you woke suddenly at the stroke of midnight. The room was perfectly still, yet there was an invitation in the air. A low, rhythmic vibration was thrumming through the floorboards like a giant cat purring in the basement. Your stomach gave a small, persistent growl, reminding you that the scone from breakfast was a distant memory. You slipped out of bed, guided by the silver-gray moonlight. As you opened your door, you found the hallway illuminated not by lamps, but by a trail of faint, glowing embers floating in the air, tiny sparks of light that seemed to drift toward the service stairs. You followed them. The air grew warmer as you descended toward the back of the inn. You bypassed the lobby and entered the kitchen, a cavernous room that felt like the engine room of a great ship. It was a space of heavy cast-iron stoves, copper pots hanging from the ceiling like polished bells, and massive butcher block tables scarred by a century of chopping and kneading. The kitchen should have been dark and cold at this hour, but it was vibrant with a spectral energy. The great wood-burning stove in the corner was glowing a dull cherry red. A large copper pot sat on its surface, and as you approached, the smell hit you. Rich, dark chocolate, toasted marshmallows, and a hint of peppermint. "Clara?" you whispered, your breath hitching. A shadow moved near the pantry. It wasn't the lady in the silver shawl this time. This shadow was larger, broader, and moved with a heavy, jovial gait. It was the cook, a man whose presence felt like a warm loaf of bread.
You didn't see his face clearly, but you saw the flash of a white apron and the shimmer of a large wooden spoon. A heavy ceramic mug, thick-walled and painted with a simple sprig of holly, slid across the wooden table toward you. It was filled to the brim with steaming cocoa, topped with a cloud of cream that was slowly melting into a marble pattern of white and brown. You sat on a tall wooden stool. As you took a sip, the heat spread through you like a liquid sun. It was the best thing you had ever tasted, rich, not too sweet, with a depth of flavor that suggested it had been simmering since the dawn of time. As you drank, you noticed something on the table next to your mug. It was a heavy, rusted iron ring with 3 keys. They weren't like the bell key for the turret or the skeleton key from the hearth. These were utilitarian, cold, and marked with stamped brass tags: cellar, pantry, ice house. The shadow of the cook pointed a translucent finger toward a small, heavy door behind the stove. "The secret?" you asked. The shadow nodded and then slowly dissipated into the scent of cinnamon. You picked up the keys. They were heavy and freezing cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the cocoa. You walked to the small door. It led to a steep, narrow set of stone stairs that spiraled down into the very foundations of the inn. The air here was damp and smelled of wet earth and ancient stone. At the bottom of the stairs, you found a room that wasn't on any floor plan. It was the foundations room. The walls were made of massive granite blocks, the same stone as the mountains outside. In the center of the room, built directly into the bedrock, was a small, ornate iron safe. You tried the keys. The one marked cellar didn't fit. Neither did pantry. You reached for the 3rd key, ice house, but as you did, you noticed a 4th, tiny key hidden behind the brass tags. It was made of gold and shaped like a minute, delicate bell. It fit the safe perfectly. With a heavy mechanical clunk, the safe door swung open. Inside was not gold or jewels, but a single leather-bound ledger and a small glass jar filled with lavender. You opened the ledger to the very last page. It wasn't a guest book. It was a book of joys. In it, Clara had recorded every happy moment that had happened in the inn. 1912, a child saw his first snow. 1944, a soldier returned to find his wife waiting by the fire. 1988, 2 strangers shared a scone and realized they were no longer strangers. The last entry was dated today. In fresh, wet ink, it read, December 2025. A traveler found the silence, drank the cocoa, and remembered how to breathe. The realization hit you with the force of a physical blow. The secret of the Silver Bell Inn wasn't that it was haunted by ghosts. It was that it was a reservoir of human peace. The spirits didn't stay because they were trapped. They stayed to protect the happiness they had witnessed. They were the curators of the soul's rest. You closed the ledger and locked the safe. As you climbed the stairs back to the kitchen, the mug of cocoa was still worn on the table, but the copper pot was now cold and empty. The sparks of light in the air were gone. You walked back to your room, the gold bell key clutched in your hand. You didn't feel like a guest anymore. You felt like a part of the ledger. You felt like a joy that had been recorded and protected. As you slipped back into bed, the last thing you heard was the soft, distant sound of the cook humming a jolly, wordless tune in the kitchen, a sound that made the entire inn feel like a giant, warm heart beating against the cold of the New Hampshire night.
The secret of the locked music box. The golden bell key from the cellar sat on your nightstand, its polished surface reflecting the dying embers of the hearth. Beside it rested the music box you had retrieved from the library's hidden alcove. For hours you had watched them, the heavy silence of the inn pressing against your ears.
The snowbound silence was no longer just a weather condition. It had become a sanctuary, a vacuum where the only things that mattered were the artifacts of a century-old love story. You picked up the music box. The bird's eye maple was cool to the touch, the silver bell inlay on the lid shimmering like a coin at the bottom of a clear stream. Earlier, it had played its fragmented version of In the Bleak Midwinter, but you felt a resistance in the gears, a hidden chamber that hadn't yet been reached. You examined the bottom of the box. There, hidden beneath a small flap of blue velvet, was a second, much smaller keyhole. It wasn't shaped for a standard key. It was circular, with 3 tiny notches. You looked at the golden bell key. Its tip was fashioned into a delicate 3-pronged crown. With a hand that trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of the moment, you inserted the golden key into the base of the music box. It turned like a silk thread snapping. Click, purr. Suddenly, the lid didn't just open, it detached slightly, sliding back to reveal a false bottom. Inside lay a small velvet-lined compartment. Tucked within was a single object, a silver wedding band, surprisingly heavy, with an inscription engraved on the inner curve. You held it up to the firelight. Thomas to Clara, no mountain too high, no winter too long, 1918. As you read the words, the music box began to play again, but the melody had changed. It was no longer the lonely, haunting carol from before. It was a waltz, rich, layered, and vibrant. It was the sound of a ballroom in full swing, the notes cascading through the room like champagne bubbles. Then, the final mystery began to unfold. The walls of room 2B didn't just show you visions, they began to breathe with them. The blue velvet curtains rippled, and the scent of lavender was suddenly joined by the smell of expensive tobacco and French perfume. You weren't just watching a memory, you were being pulled into the very center of it. In the center of the room, 2 figures appeared. They were clearer than any of the ghosts you had seen before. Thomas, in his sharp military dress uniform, held Clara, the lady in the silver shawl, close to his chest. They were dancing. Her shawl trailed behind her like a comet's tail of silver lace, catching the light of the fire as they spun. "I thought I'd lost it," Clara's voice whispered, not in your mind this time, but as a soft, physical sound in the air. "The mountain only holds what we give it, Clara," Thomas replied, his deep, resonant baritone. "I gave it my promise to return. It held that promise until this night." You realized then the true nature of the haunting. Clara hadn't been staying at the Silver Bell Inn because she was a lost soul. She was the anchor. She had stayed behind to keep the hearth burning so that the memory of her husband and the ring that symbolized their bond would have a place to return to. The items you had found, the thimble, the music box, the ledger, the key, were all pieces of a spiritual map she had laid out for 100 years, waiting for a guest who was quiet enough to follow the trail. The ring in your hand began to vibrate, growing warmer and warmer until it felt like a coal from the fire. "Give it to her," a voice, perhaps the house itself, commanded. You stood up and walked toward the dancing figures. They felt like a pocket of intense heat in the center of the room. As they spun past you, you reached out. You didn't try to touch Clara's hand. Instead, you placed the ring on the edge of the writing desk where the silver thimble had sat earlier. The moment the metal touched the wood, the music box reached a crescendo. A blinding flash of silver light filled the room, so bright you had to shield your eyes. When you opened them, the room was silent. The snowbound silence had returned, deeper and more profound than ever. Thomas and Clara were gone. The music box sat on the nightstand, its lid closed, its gears finally at rest. But on the writing desk, the ring was no longer there. In its place was a small, fresh sprig of white heather, a flower that symbolizes protection and the fulfillment of a wish. And next to it, written in the dust of the maple wood, was a final message. The hearth is complete. The final mystery was not a secret of death, but a secret of resolution. The Silver Bell Inn was no longer a place of waiting. The two halves of a century-old promise had finally been joined. You felt a massive weight lift from the atmosphere of the room. The air felt lighter, the shadows less heavy. You walked to the window and pulled back the blue velvet curtains. The blizzard had stopped. The clouds had parted, revealing a sky so full of stars they looked like spilled diamonds. The mountains were no longer walls, they were monuments. You felt a deep, soul-level exhaustion. You climbed back into the bed, and this time you didn't feel the phantom touch of a tuck-in. You didn't need to. The house was at peace, and so were you. As you drifted off, the last thing you saw was the moonlight hitting the sprig of white heather. You realized that you weren't just a traveler who had survived a storm. You were the one who had helped the Silver Bell Inn finally find its own Christmas morning. The journey was over. The hearth was quiet. And for the first time in 100 years, the lady in the silver shawl was finally, truly asleep.
A walk through the frosted orchard. The sun rose over the white mountains, not with a shout, but with a whisper of pale gold and rose. When you woke in room 2B, the first thing you noticed was the light. It was no longer the bruised purple of the storm or the haunting silver of the moon. It was a clear, diamond-bright radiance that bounced off the snow and danced across the ceiling. The snow-bound silence of the night had transformed into the frosted clarity of the morning. You felt a strange, buoyant energy as you dressed. The air in the room felt remarkably still, as if the inn itself were taking a long, satisfied nap after the events of the midnight dance. The sprig of white heather remained on the desk, a dry but fragrant reminder that the night had not been a dream. You tucked it into your pocket and headed downstairs. The lobby was flooded with sunshine. The great stone fireplace was cold now, the gray ash sitting quietly in the hearth, but the room didn't feel chilly. It felt like a house that had finally seen its guests off on a long journey and was enjoying the peaceful morning after. There were no notes on the desk, no tea waiting in the dining room, just the smell of cold, fresh pine and the dazzling light. You pushed open the heavy oak front door. The snow was piled high, nearly reaching the height of the porch railing, but a narrow, perfect path had been cleared, or perhaps simply wind-swept, leading away from the porch and toward the back of the property. You stepped out. The air was so cold it made the hair in your nose crinkle, yet the sun on your back was as warm as a wool coat. You followed the path around the side of the inn, past the kitchen windows where the copper pots hung in silent rows, and into the frosted orchard. The orchard was a cathedral of ice. Hundreds of ancient apple trees, their trunks gnarled and black against the white landscape, stood in rows that stretched down toward the frozen lake. Every single branch, every tiny twig, and every remaining shriveled leaf was encased in a thick layer of crystalline rime. As the light hit them, the trees didn't just sparkle, they hummed with a prismatic fire, throwing tiny rainbows across the snow. As you walked, you noticed something in the pristine white powder. Footprints. They weren't your own, and they weren't the deep, heavy prints in the modern winter boot. They were small, light, and delicate, the marks of a lady's lace-up boot from another century. And beside them were the larger, broader prints of a man's heavy soldiering boots. They moved together, side by side, heading deep into the heart of the orchard. You followed them, your own boots making a satisfying crunch, crunch in the crusty snow.
The air was so silent you could hear the microscopic tink, tink, tink of the ice expanding on the trees as the sun warmed it. The tracks led to a specific tree at the very center of the orchard, a massive, sprawling crabapple tree that looked like a giant's hand reaching for the sky. The ice here was thicker, forming long, translucent spears that reached for the ground. Beneath the tree, the snow had been disturbed. It looked as though two people had stood there for a long time, looking out at the mountains. And there, hanging from the lowest branch, was a single silver bell. It wasn't the small marble-sized bell from your pillow, or the one on the music box. This was a real bell, about the size of a fist, tied to the tree with a weathered red silk ribbon. As a stray breeze caught it, the bell gave a soft, deep chime, a sound that resonated across the frozen lake like a call to prayer. You reached out to touch the bell, but as your hand grew close, you saw them. They weren't ghosts anymore, not in the sense of shadows or mist. In the brilliant morning light, they looked like a shimmer in the air, a mirage of heat rising from the snow. Thomas and Clara were standing just a few feet away. They weren't looking at you. They were looking at the horizon, where the peaks of the White Mountains met the sky. Thomas had his arm around Clara's shoulders, and her head rested against his chest. Her silver shawl was no longer a haunting lace. It looked like a simple, elegant garment catching the sun. They looked peaceful. They looked finished. As you watched, the shimmer began to expand, blending into the white brilliance of the snow and the gold of the sun. The footprints at your feet didn't disappear, but they began to fill with the light until the path they had made looked like a road of molten silver. The chime of the bell rang out one last time, a clear, final note that seemed to signal the end of a very long watch. You stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into your boots, but your heart feeling impossibly light. The frosted orchard was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a place of rest. The Silver Bell Inn had done its job. It had held the memory, kept the fire, and waited for the morning. As you turned to walk back to the inn, you looked back at the tree. The silver bell was gone. There was no red ribbon, no medal, nothing but the ice-covered branches of the crabapple tree. The footprints, too, had vanished, smoothed over by the gentle morning wind as if they had never been there at all. But in your pocket, the sprig of white heather felt warm. You walked back toward the porch, seeing the smoke finally starting to curl from the chimney again. The world was waking up. The roads would soon be plowed, the phones would start ringing, and the modern world would come rushing back into the valley. But you knew that a part of you would always stay here, in the quiet, in the lavender-scented rooms, and in the memory of a dance that lasted 100 years. You were no longer just a traveler. You were a witness to the fact that even in the deepest winter, the hearth never truly goes out.
Shadows dancing on the parlor wall. The afternoon sun began its slow, heavy tilt toward the western peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows of the window frames across the parlor floor. The intense brilliance of the morning had softened into a mellow, honey-colored glow that felt like the golden hour of a lifetime. Outside, the distant, muffled roar of a snowplow signaled that the silent pocket was finally being reconnected to the rest of Vermont. The world was coming back for you, but for a few more hours, you were a guest of the quiet. You returned to the parlor, the room where you had seen the lady in the silver shawl at the piano. The air was still, yet it felt charged with a gentle, lingering electricity, the kind of atmosphere that remains after a beautiful piece of music has ended, but before the silence takes its place. You settled onto the velvet settee, the fabric cool and smooth.
On the opposite wall, the fading sunlight created a theater of shadows. As the branches of the ancient trees outside swayed in the post-storm breeze, their shadows danced across the floral wallpaper. At first, they were just branches, but as you watched, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. They weren't the sharp, defined ghosts of the night. These were memory shadows. You saw the flicker of a shadow that looked like a tall man leaning down to light a cigar, another that resembled a woman adjusting the tinsel on a tree that was no longer there. They moved with a slow, graceful rhythm, a silent ballet of 100 years of afternoon tea and quiet conversations. In this state of deep contemplation, you realized that the Silver Bell Inn was more than just a building. It was a vessel. It held the things that people usually discard: the quiet sighs of relief, the unspoken gratitude for a warm fire, the brief moments of peace between the storms of life. You pulled the small sprig of white heather from your pocket. It was dry now, but its fragrance was potent, filling your senses with the smell of high mountain meadows. You looked at the piano. The silver bell was gone, but the wood of the instrument seemed to glow with a deep internal warmth. You felt as though you had been given a rare gift, the chance to see behind the curtain of time, to witness a love that refused to be extinguished by the cold. A soft sound came from the hallway, the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock. It felt like the heartbeat of the inn, steady and undemanding. You found yourself thinking about your own life, the world you were about to return to. The deadlines and the noise felt less daunting now. You realized that you could carry this snowbound silence within you. You could be your own hearth. The shadows on the wall began to stretch and blur as the sun dipped behind a jagged ridge. The honey light turned to a deep, bruised orange, then to a soft violet. The dancing figures on the wall slowed their pace, bowing to one another before merging back into the darkness of the corners. The parlor grew cold, but you didn't move. You sat there in the deepening twilight, a witness to the final act of the inn's long vigil. The whispers in the hearth, the scent of lavender, and the lady in the silver shawl were all part of you now. You were the bridge between their past and the world's future. As the first star appeared in the window, exactly where the moon had been the night before, you stood up. Your limbs felt heavy but rested. You walked to the door of the parlor and looked back one last time. The room was empty, yet it felt full. "Thank you for the dance," you whispered. The shadows didn't move, but a single soft note vibrated from the piano, a low, resonant string humming in response to your voice. The world was reopening, the roads were clear, and the journey back was beginning. But as you walked toward the stairs to pack your bags, you knew you weren't leaving the Silver Bell Inn behind. You were taking the silver bell with you, ringing forever in the quietest part of your heart.
A midnight prayer for the lonely. As you prepared for your final night at the Silver Bell Inn, a strange gravity took hold of the house. The snowbound silence of the previous nights had evolved into something more profound, a deep spiritual stillness. Though the plows had carved a path to the valley and your car was now clear of its white shroud, you found yourself unable to leave just yet. There was one final rhythm the inn needed to share. Midnight approached, and with it, the air in the lobby grew thin and sweet, like the atmosphere at a great altitude. You found yourself drawn not to the hearth, but to the small frosted glass chapel at the very edge of the inn's east wing. It was a tiny room, barely larger than a pantry, with 2 wooden pews and a simple altar made of local birch.
Inside, the light was purely celestial. The stars outside were so bright they cast shadows through the stained glass, a simple pattern of lilies and bells. You sat in the front pew, the wood cold and smooth beneath you. Then the prayer began. It wasn't a spoken prayer, it was a collective sigh of the house. You felt a presence fill the pews behind you. You didn't turn around. You knew that if you did, you might see the hundreds of lonely who had passed through these doors over the last century. These were the travelers who had arrived with heavy hearts, the widows who had spent their first Christmas alone here, and the soldiers who had sat in these very pews, staring at the mountains and wondering if they would ever see home again. The air began to hum with a low, resonant frequency, the sound of 100 hearts beating in unison. You felt a wave of immense, compassionate sorrow, followed immediately by a surge of overwhelming hope. It was the midnight prayer for the lonely, the spiritual legacy of Clara and Thomas. In your mind, you saw Clara standing at the altar. She wasn't holding a Bible or a candle. She was holding the silver bell. She rang it once, a sound so pure it felt like it was cleaning the very molecules of the air. For those who are lost in the white, her voice echoed, a thought that felt like a warm hand on your brow. For those whose hearths have gone cold, for those who carry a silence that no one else hears, in this house you are found. In this house, the bell rings for you. You realized then that the inn's true purpose wasn't just to provide a bed or a meal. It was a lighthouse for the soul. The ghosts were not hauntings, they were guardians. They stayed to ensure that no one who entered the Silver Bell Inn would ever truly be alone, even in the middle of a mountain blizzard. A warmth spread from your pocket. The wooden bell from the attic and the sprig of heather seemed to vibrate in response to the prayer. You felt a deep clicking sense of closure. The loneliness you had brought with you, the modern digital loneliness of a busy life, was being absorbed by the ancient stone and timber of the chapel. It was being recycled into peace. As the clock in the lobby began its 12-tone journey into the new day, the presence in the room faded. The prayer was over. The chapel was once again just a small, cold room with birchwood furniture. But as you stood up to leave, you noticed a single small candle burning on the altar. You hadn't lit it, and there was no draft to explain its flickering. It was a steady flame, the kind that doesn't go out when the wind blows. You walked back to your room, your footsteps light on the carpet. The midnight prayer was the final lesson of the Silver Bell Inn. You understood now that you weren't just a guest, you were a carrier of the flame. You were leaving the mountains, but you were taking the prayer with you. You were taking the knowledge that somewhere, in a high valley in New Hampshire, a bell was always ringing for the lonely, and a hearth was always waiting to be shared. You slept that night without dreams, a sleep of such absolute safety that it felt like being held by the mountains themselves. The soft touch of an invisible hand. The final morning at the Silver Bell Inn did not begin with the intrusive chime of an alarm or the harsh glare of a winter sun. Instead, it began with a soft, weightless pressure against your forehead, a touch so light it could have been a stray strand of hair or the ghost of a dream. But as your eyes fluttered open, you knew it was neither. It was a benediction. The room was bathed in a pale, buttery light. The blizzard had left behind a world of impossible purity. Through the window, the white mountains stood sharp and blue against a sky that looked like polished porcelain. The fire in the hearth had finally gone out, leaving only a bed of soft gray ash that smelled faintly of sweet smoke and memory. The final pack. As you moved to pack your bags, the rhythmic silence of the inn felt different. It was no longer the silence of an invitation, but the silence of a fond farewell. Your movements were slow and deliberate. You checked the room one last time, ensuring you left nothing behind, though you knew you were taking the most important things with you. The wooden bell, tucked safely into the velvet lining of your coat pocket. The sprig of heather, now dry and brittle, yet still smelling of the high ridges. The joy, a lightness in your chest that hadn't been there when you arrived. Just as you reached for your suitcase, you felt it again, the soft touch of an invisible hand. It rested briefly on your shoulder, a firm yet ethereal presence that felt warm despite the morning chill. It wasn't the touch of a stranger, it was the touch of a grandmother sending a child off to school, or a friend lingering at the gate. It carried a message of quiet pride. You listened, you remembered, you may go now. The descent. You walked out into the hallway, the iron key feeling heavy and cold in your hand. The corridor seemed longer this morning, the shadows of the banisters stretching across the burgundy carpet like the fingers of a giant. As you descended the grand staircase, the wood didn't groan with its usual effort. It gave a series of light, rhythmic clicks, like a heartbeat following you down. The lobby was empty, yet it felt vibrantly alive. The lavender was gone, replaced by the crisp, ozonic smell of the mountain air drifting through the vents. You walked to the reception desk and placed the heavy key onto the dark walnut surface. Tink! A small silver bell on the desk, the inn's namesake, rang once entirely on its own. It wasn't a warning, it was a safe travels. You looked toward the parlor, where the memory shadows had danced the day before. The room was still, the piano covered in a fine layer of dust that sparkled in the sun. The lady in the silver shawl was nowhere to be seen, yet you felt her presence in the very grain of the wood. The threshold. At the front door, you paused. The brass handle was cold. You took one last breath of the inn's interior air, that unique mixture of wood smoke, old paper, and ancient peace. You realized then that the invisible hand hadn't just touched your shoulder, it had touched the very mechanism of your soul. As you stepped out onto the porch, the transition was sharp. The biting cold of the New Hampshire winter rushed to meet you, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt invigorating. You looked back at the Silver Bell Inn. It sat amongst the snowdrifts like a grand sleeping animal, its chimneys silent, its windows reflecting the brilliant blue of the sky. The door clicked shut behind you, a solid final sound. You were no longer a guest, you were a traveler again. But as you walked toward your car, you felt the ghost of that hand one last time, a gentle pat on your back, urging you forward into the bright, clear world. The silent pocket was behind you, but the silence was now inside you.
The final toast to yesteryear. Before the car door could click shut, before the engine could sever the umbilical cord of silence, the inn gave one final, irresistible pull. It wasn't a haunting command, but a soft, melodic invitation, the sound of 100 crystal glasses clinking in a distant room. You found yourself stepping back onto the porch, the heavy oak doors swinging open as if the house itself were drawing a deep, festive breath. Inside, the lobby had undergone a final, breathtaking transformation. The snowbound silence was gone, replaced by the vibrant golden roar of a celebration that transcended time. The grand transformation. The Great Hall was no longer a dusty relic of the 1920s. It was 1924. The chandeliers, once dim and draped in cobwebs, were now ablaze with 1,000 candles, their light dancing off the polished mahogany banisters. The scent of lavender and old lace had been joined by the festive aroma of roasted chestnuts, spiced pomanders, and the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut balsam. You walked toward the parlor, and your breath caught. The room was full. There was the cook, no longer a shadow, but a robust man in a pristine white toque, carrying a silver tray of steaming cider. There were the young couples you had seen in the library's reflections, dressed in velvet and silk, their laughter sounding like the chime of small bells. And there, by the grand piano, stood Thomas and Clara. They were no longer shimmering mirages. In this final toast, they looked as solid as the stone of the mountains. Thomas, in his dress uniform, held a crystal coupe filled with a bubbling amber liquid. Clara, her silver shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders, looked radiant, the morning of the last century replaced by a timeless golden joy. The gathering of shadows. As you entered, the room fell into a respectful, warm hush. These were the spirits of yesteryear, the collective memory of every guest who had ever found peace within these walls. They weren't ghosts in the frightening sense. They were the guardians of hospitality. Clara stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm. She raised her glass toward you. "To the one who listened," she said, her voice a soft, clear bell that echoed in the very marrow of your bones. "To the traveler who found the hearth in the middle of the storm. You have helped us complete the circle. Tonight, the Silver Bell Inn is not a house of waiting, but a house of arrival." Thomas raised his glass as well, a small, knowing smile on his face. "To the living, may you carry the warmth of this fire wherever the road leads. In the mountains, we say that no winter is too long if the cider is shared." The toast. The cook handed you a glass. It was cold to the touch, but sent a wave of heat through your palm. You raised it high, looking at the faces gathered around you, the faces of 100 years of human connection. "To the silver bell," you whispered, "and to those who keep the light in the window." As you drank, the liquid tasted of sun-warmed apples and starlight. A wave of profound contentment washed over you, a feeling of absolute belonging. For a single eternal moment, you weren't a guest from the future. You were a part of the tapestry. You were a character in the story of the inn, a joy recorded in the golden ledger. The music from the piano swelled, a bright, jaunty waltz. The spirits began to dance, their forms blurring into a swirl of silver, gold, and charcoal. The room began to glow with an intensity that was almost too bright to bear, a crescendo of light and sound that celebrated the end of the long watch. Slowly, the golden light began to soften. The voices grew distant, turning back into the gentle hum of the wind. The scent of cider faded into the smell of cold, fresh pine. One by one, the spirits dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind only the soft, lingering vibration of the piano's final note. You were standing alone in the quiet lobby once more. The candles were out, the fire was ash, and the shadows were just shadows. But the taste of the cider remained on your lips, and the warmth of the toast remained in your heart. The final toast to yesteryear was over. The spirits were at rest. You turned toward the door, finally ready to face the world, knowing that you had been a guest at the greatest party the White Mountains had ever seen.
The waking dream. The transition from the grand spectral toast back to the interior of your car was a silent explosion. One moment, your hand felt the weight of a crystal coupe. The next, it gripped the cold synthetic leather of the steering wheel. The sudden shift in reality left you breathless, your heart hammering a frantic rhythm against your ribs. You looked at the Silver Bell Inn through the windshield, and for a heartbeat, the building seemed to shimmer, its solid timber walls fluttering like a curtain in a draft. The shifting reality. As you pulled away, the rearview mirror offered a final impossible sight. The inn didn't just grow smaller, it seemed to sink back into the landscape. The dark green roof merged with the pine needles, and the white siding became indistinguishable from the snowdrifts. It was then that the realization hit you. The Silver Bell was not merely a building. It was a waking dream, a physical manifestation of a memory so powerful it had carved its own space in the material world. You remembered the ledger in the cellar, the book of joys that had recorded your own arrival before you had even stepped through the door. You remembered the heat of the fire that told stories and the tea that poured itself. These weren't just hauntings, they were the inn's way of breathing. The Silver Bell was an anchor for a specific frequency of peace, a place where the barrier between what was and what is had been intentionally dissolved by Clara's relentless devotion. The inn as a living being. The further you drove down the notch, the more you realized that the inn was a living entity, a collective consciousness of hospitality. It was more than a sanctuary. It was a reconstructor of souls. You glanced at your reflection in the mirror. Your eyes looked different, clearer, deeper, as if the mountain air had scrubbed away the film of 1,000 digital distractions. You realized that the waking dream wasn't something you had experienced at the inn. It was something the inn had performed on you. It had invited you into its dream so that you could remember how to exist in your own reality. Every creak of the floorboards was a heartbeat. Every scent of lavender was a thought. The lady in the silver shawl wasn't a ghost trapped in the past. She was the consciousness of the house, ensuring that the hearth remained a living, breathing promise of safety for anyone lost in the storms of the modern world. The lingering magic. You reached for your phone, which had finally found a signal. It vibrated with a sudden fury, messages about urgent meetings and missed opportunities. A few days ago, these sounds would have triggered a spike of cortisol. Now they felt like the distant buzzing of a harmless insect. You reached into your pocket and pulled out the wooden bell. It felt heavier than it should, its rough carved surface vibrating with a low, grounding hum. You realized the inn had given you a tether. As long as you held this token, the waking dream would never truly end. You were now a part of the Silver Bell's architecture, a living stone in its invisible wall of peace. The mountains began to recede, the jagged peaks softening into rolling hills. You were back in the world of gray slush and neon signs, but the interior of your car still smelled faintly of burnt sugar and balsam. The inn was gone from your sight, but it was now firmly established in your spirit, a secret room you could retreat to whenever the world grew too loud. You smiled, a slow, quiet expression that mirrored Clara's final look. You understood the secret now. The Silver Bell Inn is always there, tucked in the folds of the White Mountains, waiting for the next soul who needs to wake up from the nightmare of the world and enter the beautiful, healing dream of the hearth.
The lingering warmth of the Silver Bell Inn. The highway eventually straightened, the jagged, snow-capped notch shrinking into a jagged line of white on the horizon. The landscape changed from the wild, unyielding drama of the high peaks to the familiar, rolling terrain of the valley towns. Traffic became denser. The hum of tires on pavement replaced the crunch of snow, and the digital clock on the dashboard marched forward into a Tuesday that the rest of the world considered ordinary. Yet, as you sat in the driver's seat, steering back into the current of modern life, the lingering warmth of the Silver Bell Inn remained wrapped around you like the silver shawl itself. The inner hearth. You realized, as the miles stretched between you and the mountains, that you hadn't just stayed at an inn. You had undergone a quiet transformation.
The silent pocket was no longer a location you had visited. It was a sanctuary you had built within yourself. Every time the world pressed too hard, every time a horn honked or an email pinged with manufactured urgency, you found you could simply reach for the memory of the blue velvet curtains, and the noise would instantly soften. The heat you had felt from the hearth wasn't just physical. It was a spiritual embers glow that seemed to radiate from your very center. You found yourself driving more slowly, breathing more deeply, and looking at the world with a newfound patience. The waking dream had left you with a secret clarity. The storm outside may be fierce, but the hearth inside is yours to tend. A small miracle. Stopping for coffee at a busy roadside station, you felt like a traveler from another dimension. The neon lights seemed unnecessarily bright, the music too loud, the people too hurried. As you stood in line, a small child, bundled in a puffy red coat and looking exhausted by the journey, began to cry. Without thinking, you reached into your pocket and your fingers brushed against the wooden bell. You didn't take it out, but as you touched it, a wave of that ancient, lavender-scented peace flowed through you. You caught the child's eye and gave a small, slow smile, the same smile Clara had given you in the parlor. The child stopped crying instantly, eyes widening as if they could see the silver light still clinging to your shoulders. For a brief second, the chaotic gas station felt as quiet as the inn's library. It was a small miracle of lingering warmth, a reminder that the peace you had found was meant to be shared, not hoarded. The bell that rings forever. Back on the road, the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the highway. You knew that tonight, back in your own bed, the silence would feel different. It would no longer be an empty silence, but a filled one. You would hear the faint, rhythmic tink-tink of the silver bell in the back of your mind, a steady signal fire for your soul. The Silver Bell Inn would continue its long, quiet watch in the notch. Clara would still adjust the lace, the cook would still simmer the cocoa, and Thomas would still stand by the hearth, ensuring the fire never truly went out. They didn't need you to be there for the magic to happen, but they needed you to carry the story out into the world. As you finally pulled into your own driveway, you turned off the engine. The world was still. You sat for a moment in the dark, holding the wooden bell in your palm. It felt solid, real, and eternal. The journey was over, but the lingering warmth was just beginning. You stepped out of the car, looked up at the winter stars, and for the first time in a very long time, you were home, not because of the house in front of you, but because of the bell ringing softly in your heart. The hearth was complete, the storm was a memory, and the silver bell will ring forever. This concludes our long-form cozy ghost story. I hope the warmth of the Silver Bell Inn stays with you. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night and happy holidays.